So we've been looking at a few different chapters each week in our Wednesday study from this book, Separation of Church and Hate by John Fugelsang. And we're nearing the end of the book. Next week will be our last study in this particular series. And tonight, what I want to talk about is a combination of different things, but it's all really related to violence. And as we know, we have seen the eruption of violence around the world this past weekend with the attack on Iran. And so this might have some relationship to some of the things that are going on. But more importantly than that, what we're really going to talk about is capital punishment tonight. And we're going to take a look at the topic and see the pros and cons of it. And you'll need to just kind of decide for yourself what your thoughts are on this particular topic. So I want to get started with this introduction. When I use the term state-sponsored violence, it could be either legally or extra legally. That is, it's something that is not regulated or even allowed by law, but both are used in various ways to harm or silence, sometimes imprison, and sometimes execute people or groups of people. And this particular topic is one that seems to always come up at various times in the history of our own nation. And more importantly, this topic in some countries is something that will be it will be something to be fought against and demonstrated against and those type of things. So uh, when we're talking about state-sponsored violence, in general, it can be executions or military policing, political imprisonment, that type of thing. But for tonight, we're going to talk primarily about capital punishment. And we're going to talk a little bit about, is capital punishment a violation of God's will? Now, the author of the book suggests that in recent decades, that presidential candidates, if they're asked about this topic, always come down positive on the side of capital punishment. And he suggests, this is his opinion, that if a president was to deny capital punishment, that it would almost be kind of a death blow to their candidacy. He mentions in the book that every U.S. president in recent memory professes to be a Christian, or at least aligned with the Judeo-Christian ethic. And then when asked about the death penalty, they're in favor of it. There's only been one person really that has vocalized opposition to it, and that's Jimmy Carter. And he suggests that it would almost be impossible to be elected if you were to be opposed to the death penalty because you've gone woke and those type of things. So it's a appropriate question to ask. Is the death penalty against God's will? And what do we do with some of the passages in the Old Testament that speak about it? Is the death penalty one of Jesus's teachings that's most prominent in his life in the gospel? So let's take a look at it and let's kind of work at some of the different cross references and see what we come up with. First thing to keep in mind, I think, when we talk about the capital punishment, in the season of Lent, we're leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus, who was executed by the state, victim of the empire. There's a whole lot of history behind Pontius Pilate and why he gave approval for Jesus's execution. He had made some political missteps. He was not in favor with Caesar back in Rome. He was kind of afraid that if there was a uprising that would occur under this particular moment in history, that he could lose his position as the Roman governor of Judea. But there's all kinds of emotions in the Gospels when we think about why he did what he did. He feared unrest, as you can see on the screen. He feared losing control, but most of all, he feared the repercussions from Caesar. And Pilate tries to get out from under having Jesus crucified. That's why he offers two criminals, one to be let go, Barabbas and Jesus. And the crowd, not all the Jewish people, but at least that cluster of Jewish people, call for the release of Barabbas, who was a noted terrorist. He was an individual that used a lot of terrorism in trying to get the people freed. And that's the type of Messiah that many of the Jewish people wanted, a militarized Messiah that might lead them to freedom. What you'll find is in the verdict of Pontius Pilate, he exercises what is always used in this question. The empire, whether it is Rome or any other empire, demonstrates their dominance over the people that they try, they condemn, and they execute. So on Good Friday, as we lead into that, and during the Lenten season, we see that the machinery of the Roman Empire is used to execute a Jewish rabbi. And there's a lot of false accusations launched at Jesus. He preached about the kingdom of God. The idea of a kingdom was maybe threatening, but more than anything else, there was a group of people that saw him as a threat to their power. And so you have this kangaroo court that comes together. He's tried and he is convicted. And of course, we know the story of him being crucified. Now, the joining up in this story between those who had the power to execute Jesus and religion is an interesting connection because it's religiously motivated and it is empire executed. So when we think about why religion might execute an innocent rabbi like Jesus, you have to go back, I guess, to understanding the mindset led up to that moment on Good Friday. When you look at the Old Testament, one of the things that you'll notice is that there is the law of retaliation. It's often called lex talionis, and it's a very strict justice that is built on this idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And it's a part of the Mosaic law that was given to the nation as they wander in the wilderness, leading to a land where they would settle down and make it their home. You see in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, the references there, each of them specify kind of a limitation of retaliation. In other words, if I was to steal your goat, you shouldn't put me to death for that. But on the other hand, the idea if there is some type of manslaughter or premeditated murder, the justification was to take a life for a life. So when you look at the basis of the Old Testament law, this constitutional framing for a new nation, and as it works its way through the Old Testament, and you do see some various specific things that are mentioned that deserves the death penalty, and I'll show you some of those in a moment. You then have to ask, by the time you kind of entered into the New Testament, what does Jesus do with that? And of course, in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, you have Jesus use his you have heard it said speech, and this particular part of it in Matthew chapter 5, and let me get to it here. in Matthew chapter 5, and you come down to verse 38 and 39, he builds up by talking about, you have heard it said, but I say to you. And here is the lex talionis of the Old Testament that he is referring to. It says in verse 38, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Now, at this point, the important thing to keep in mind here is the humiliation, the slap on the cheek, turn to them the other cheek, and the other one here, if someone takes your cloak, or if anyone is going to sue you and take your shirt, give them your coat as well. At this point, it's not life-threatening, is it? And so a lot of times, the justification will be, well, Jesus would be different if he was referring to someone that is trying to kill you. Well, he keeps going. If you come down to verse 43, he says, you have heard it said that love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So now he takes it a little bit further. Now he's talking about enemies, not just talking about thieves, enemies in the sense of some people that are dangerous and threatening and that type of thing. So it seems at this point, Jesus is loosening a little bit the lex talionis, strict justice of the Old Testament. What you do find is the nation that is here already in place, but has been in captivity now for hundreds of years, would find this rather irritating and offensive to advocate for forgiveness, to move beyond a strict legalism to the law, to a better spirit of reconciliation and so forth. So you see Jesus moving away from that strictness of the Old Testament. So let's keep that in mind as we consider some of these examples. So when you look in the Old Testament, who is worthy of a death penalty? Well, it's fascinating that there's a whole variety of different things. Now, all of these come out of the Torah, okay? These are not found in the prophets. These are not found in the historical books per se, but they are found in the Mosaic Law. And at the top of the list, you might say, worshiping other gods. Well, to understand that, you need to understand that what I mentioned several times in past studies is that Israel was not a strictly monotheistic nation until much later in its history. So there is the worship of other gods during this time. The nation initially had a polytheistic background. So the term that is used is monolatry. Out of idolatry grows this idea of monotheism. And but it's not quite developed yet in Deuteronomy, which is interesting. That'll come later in its historical development. Yet at the same time, you find this law that is laid down in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 2 through 5, that if anyone is found worshiping other gods, and I think the implication there is as their primary God, not the God that delivered them out of Egypt, then that is worthy of a death penalty. Well, now you get to some other things that, are questionable at best. When your kid's being disrespectful, Exodus 21 says, they're worthy of the death penalty. If you criticize God, also called blasphemy, you're worthy of the death penalty. If you work on the Sabbath, you're worthy of the death penalty. If you exercise any type of magic or witchcraft, you're worthy of the death penalty. Leviticus 20:10, if you're guilty of adultery, you're worthy of the death penalty. Disobedience to parents in Deuteronomy 21 is worthy of the death penalty. Now, when you begin to see it like this, you go, my goodness, did they really do that? Did they really do that? And I want to suggest to you that this law of retaliation probably worked more on the level of the court system when there was different things, bribery, thievery, yes, murder for sure. But at the same time, these things that are listed here in these cross references, I doubt were regularly enforced. In other words, these laws were in place primarily to instill fear into the hearts of the people so that they wouldn't do them. The only time we really see a strict desire to do that into the New Testament is when a woman who is caught in adultery is brought before Jesus, and he is given the question, well, what are you going to do with this, Jesus? Are you going to agree with us that she's worthy of death and stoning, or are you going to let her go and be disrespectful and disobedient to the Mosaic law? And of course, Jesus then says, well, you who are without sin, you be the first one to throw the first stone. And incidentally, this is interesting that I'll get to in a moment. The idea of stoning is something that allows you to throw the verdict of the death penalty onto someone and still claim innocence. And what I mean by that is who knows which stone actually killed the person. So you can hide behind the fact that you're part of the penalty, but you weren't the one that actually took the person's life. So it's kind of a way of doing what you want to do, and yet having some type of excuse or explanation that you're not the one that's primarily at fault. So the law of retaliation, it's found throughout the Old Testament. It really does have a bunch of different references to it. However, one of the things that you're going to find is that the brutality of it, then as we see the Old Testament move forward, it begins to change in nature. And that's why when we'll see in John 8 that Jesus is being questioned about this woman, that it's almost a bit of a surprise. And it almost seems to me that she has been set up, but we'll put that on hold. So if you fast forward thousands and thousands of years, you're going to find that the United States really does kind of stand apart from other developed nations in that we still use capital punishment, while other developed nations have moved beyond that. Now, over the last 50 years, there have been 1,570 executions. There are other countries that have done more, but you'll see in the cross references on the slide there that these are not democratic type of countries. So China, Iran, Egypt, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia all carry out this type of strict death penalty punishment, and sometimes for things as as innocent as forgetting a woman forgetting to wear her head covering, or all kinds of nonsense and so forth. So America kind of stands unique in the sense that it's a democratic republic that still holds on to the death penalty, while other countries around the world have kind of moved beyond that. Brian Stevenson, the director of the Equal Justice Initiative, says that the reality of this punishment is not applied equally, that it's inconsistent in its application. And there's a lot of things that shape the use of the death penalty. So poverty, race, geography, and local politics are four of them that he mentions. And the question comes up, why? Why is that? Is there something more that's being used with the death penalty than simply punishment for an offense and a crime? And sometimes what you'll find is statistically far more people other than white Caucasians are the victims of capital punishment. So there could be some other things that are going on with this. So what might be the reasons for some of the inconsistency? It's left to the states. It's a state level decision. And over the years, different states have concluded different things about the death penalty. So, number one is some have backed off on this simply because of the cost of capital punishment. So, whether we realize this or not, after years and years of appeals and even maintaining death row, the actual cost of the actual execution can be considerably more expensive than life without parole. And so some states have kind of backed off on that simply for a budgetary reason. Secondly, in recent years, we've seen 150 death row inmates finally freed from that verdict by DNA evidence that they were actually innocent. And how many of those individuals in prior years that could have been innocent but didn't have the DNA evidence to prove it, were they killed as innocent individuals? So that's another reason that they've kind of backed off. A third reason is botched executions in recent years. I'm going to tell you the story of the most recent one that I know of, anyways. The author in the book mentions Kenneth Eugene Smith. He is Caucasian. He's a white man. He was an individual that was executed on January the 25th, 2024 in Alabama. He was the very first death penalty execution by inhaling nitrogen, and it's called nitrogen hypoxia. Now, he was convicted actually in 1988 for a contract killing of a woman by the name of Elizabeth Sennett. And of course, so 1988 all the way till 2024. There you see how long he had been on death row. In November 2022, he was scheduled to be executed and by lethal injection. They were unable to make the IV work on him. So he had a stay of execution for another period of time. Then in 2024, they decided that they were going to try a different method on him since the IV did not work on him, and that was by breathing nitrogen gas. And so witnesses, including the chaplain that is mentioned in the book, talks about what happened to this man. Instead of a swift and humane death, it took 20 minutes for him to die. And in the book, he talks about how he is writhing on the table. And as he's writhing on the table, it's talking about how his skin began to look like there were ants underneath all of his skin because of the effect it was having. His eyes were beginning to bulge out of his head. It really was a torturous thing, and it did kill him, but it took 20 minutes to do that. And even the United Nations looked at that particular episode and condemned that execution, saying that he was being used as a guinea pig for state-sanctioned torture. Well, even the Eighth Amendment in our Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. So here's the way it reads: excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed. There's no problem with that. But when you get to cruel and unusual punishment being inflicted, that's where the problem comes. So this particular amendment was initially ratified in 1791. So it goes back a long way, talking about barbaric torture and that type of thing. This clause is often debated, and and so one of the things that courts need to step in and interpret what is cruel and unusual punishment based on modern societal values rather than those of 1791. Nonetheless, it's one of the amendments to the Constitution that it's wrong for cruel and unusual punishment. So we have just looked at a text in the Sermon on the Mount, and it seems as though Jesus, if the Sermon on the Mount is a sample of his earliest earthly teachings, really wastes no time to kind of get to that particular topic. Now, I've mentioned a couple times over already about John chapter 8. So I'm going to turn to John chapter 8. This is the one that seems to be most pertinent to the topic because Jesus is confronted with this particular topic. It says, beginning in chapter 8, verse 1, and I want you to notice something there. I don't know if you see it in your Bible or not. Do you see verses 1 down through verse 11 is italicized? Is that, I don't know if that's in your Bible or not. If you look at maybe a footnote, it'll suggest that the earliest manuscripts and many other ancient witnesses do not have John 7:53 through 8:11 in the earliest manuscripts. It seems to be a story that is added later. Few manuscripts might include the verses, but in whole, it's not there. So the translators of the Bible decide to go ahead and put the story in to the Gospel of John, but they either italicize it or put footnotes to it so that you see that this story seems to be a later addition. Okay, so here's how it reads. It says, then they all went home, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say? They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, Let any one of you who is without sin be the first one to throw a stone at her. Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. So Jesus shows compassion, shows mercy, and really he calls out the double standard and even the crime of probably setting this woman up, because where is the man in this whole scenario? Only the woman is brought before Jesus. So when you look at this, it would be a justification to, if you're using Old Testament law only, to kill this woman, to stone this woman. Jesus is deliberately ignoring the seventh commandment. And he is recognizing, I think, the universality of sin. None of us are without guilt. And he offers the woman a fresh start. So this then kind of becomes the basis for people that oppose the death penalty. And there have been those who have stood in the gap for those who often are on death row, chaplains and pastors and priests and so forth. Mother Teresa once said this: "What you do to these men on death row, you do to God." And so the approach of Jesus, it seems, is reflective of God wanting redemption, and so finding that in the story is one of the things that helps us get a better framing of what to do with this topic. So Jesus is the most famous victim of state-sanctioned violence. Um, the crucifixion is not a random act of cruelty. It's not a drive-by shooting. It's not mob violence per se. They bring Jesus before the Romans to get justification. It's not religious chaos either. Pilate has to own, even though he washes his hands, he still has to own it that his decision is what puts Jesus on the cross. So the cross here is kind of standing in the shadow of empire. And the crucifixion in that day uh, was unusual and cruel punishment, brutal, humiliating. It was devised to intentionally kill people over a course of hours, not minutes. It's a form of execution that was usually reserved for terrorists. Um, uh, but the most humiliating part of it is the victim had to carry their own device of execution. So when others were beheaded, obviously it was the Roman soldier that would bring down the axe. However, in this situation, they would often have to walk a long distance. And if you remember the episode with Jesus, he collapses under the weight of the crossbeam he is carrying, and Simon needs to help him carry the cross actually to the place of execution. Now, what's fascinating here is that while Jesus is on the cross, he doesn't call for other people to retaliate or bring vengeance upon those who killed him. His dying words emphasize mercy. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And so, from the Sermon on the Mount to the episode with the adulterous woman to Jesus' own death, I think we get a little bit of a feel for the fact that Jesus has changed the dynamic of the Old Testament law under Moses. So, when we come back to our own perspective on this, and the state by state decisions on whether to have the death penalty or not, something else to keep in mind is that the states that do uh, capital punishment implicate the citizens because the execution is done in the name of the people. So, under the U.S. system of government, sovereignty rests with we the people. Now, if a state legislature permits the death penalty, it is considered a law enacted by representatives that are chosen by the voters. And so, in a sense, we are implicated as well because we put the people in place that pushed through or did not try to intervene and reverse the death penalty. So it's framed that way because, again, it's not personal vengeance or vigilante justice, but at the same time, it implies a moral consensus that we voted these people in, and these are the people that are keeping this particular form of punishment in place. So when someone dies by the authority of the state, the people are speaking because we have given them the power to do so. So we could say we kind of are implicated. No, we didn't pull the trigger. We didn't throw the switch. However, those of us who would stand against the death penalty would say, um, "Listen, we put these people in place, and we need to do a better job." That as I rewind back to, as I mentioned before, many of the presidents in recent memory, only one, Jimmy Carter, was opposed to the death penalty. So it seems to be something that is used on a nationwide level by candidates to get elected. Um, it's always important to remember on this topic: the death penalty is permanent. I mean, once you throw the switch, once you kill the person, if later evidence comes out or later DNA proves that person to be innocent, you can't reverse it. And so, with that, it becomes a very, very complicated topic because the way it's usually framed, justice is usually framed as the way of justifying capital punishment. This person deserves it. And of course, it's really built on anger and revenge and hatred of, and rightfully so, of a person that does a very vile thing. And I'm not speaking out of a vacuum. My grandfather was murdered. But there, does the person deserve the death penalty? We'll continue to debate it. I know we will into the years ahead. But this particular chapter in the book, I think, brings up some things that help us to understand how complicated it is, and is it something that should be reversed? And you have to look at your own conscience on that and determine yay or nay on that. So we're talking about state-sanctioned violence today. And the other thing that comes into play in regard to violence is the idea of gun control. So another chapter in the book talks about the right to bear arms. And boy, is that a hot potato, right? So, as we saw on January 6th, a few years ago, um, there were people that led an attempted insurrection against the voters' will by using and carrying guns. And with each massacre that takes place by assault type weaponry, the topic comes up again and usually is dismissed in a way that guns don't kill people. Okay, I give you that. Somebody's got to be using the gun. However, one of the things that happens is it just gets dismissed with thoughts and prayers rather than really wrestling with the problem that we have with this. So, January 6th, and other white Christian nationalists that were not in Washington, D.C. on that date, maintain a proud boy tradition of the Second Amendment purism. And what I mean by that is no controls, no conditions. We should have as many guns as we want, and you shouldn't prevent me from having the freedom to do that. And like the death penalty, usually those that hold these kind of extreme positions are people that have vested interest in it. So when you think about this whole idea of gun control, you can't just think about it as a Second Amendment issue. You also have to think about it in terms of um, monetary gains, profit, and all that goes with that. So that kind of clouds things as well. So the author mentions that when the state refuses to regulate weapons, that is a policy of choice made in the name of the people. It's done in the name of the citizens, sort of like the death penalty. So he's not trying to implicate all of us with mass shootings, but what he's saying is we are the ones that are putting these people in place that are holding to these things. So what has happened, though, I think, gun control, death penalty to a certain extent, but more so gun control, and opposition to gun control and regulation really has kind of synced up with a long history that is found in Christianity. Christianity really does have a long history of violence, which is really pretty ironic when you think about we claim to be followers of the Prince of Peace, but you'll find, as you see listed on the slide there, that violence was used to gain territory, to oppress people, to own people, all those type of things. So where did that start? It happened back in the 4th century, 314 AD. Constantine has a vision of a flaming sword that he is told in this vision, go and conquer. And he does. And he makes Christianity the state religion. So they move from kind of a persecuted minority to being an imperial partner. And so the church that once followed this crucified Messiah now begins to enact violence through the Crusades, through colonial expansions, manifest destiny, nationalistic wars, and each is wrapped in sacred language. So this past weekend, we started a war with Iran. And take note in the weeks ahead, when there's a lot of loss of life, that it will be wrapped in sacred language. So our Secretary of War was talking about God's providential care over our troops because they're going to be in harm's way as we try to decapitate the Iranian leadership. I'll give you my own opinion on this. This is an unjust war. It's a war that's being done on behalf of Israel, who has wanted regime change. This is my opinion. You don't have to agree with it. But what we find is often Christianity, religious language, is used as a way of justifying it because the threat isn't there. Supposedly, all the nuclear weapons were obliterated last summer. Ballistic missiles can't reach the United States. So we're doing this on behalf of someone else because we're not at threat. So with that in mind, watch in the weeks ahead how religion will be used to justify this. So let's go back to gun violence for a moment. Gun violence is often framed around the idea of protection. Rightfully so. I'm going to protect my family, protect my freedom, protect against tyranny, possibly. However, you've known by now, because we've gone over this history several times, that this really became the modus operandi of the moral majority under Jerry Falwell. And so the moral majority really did play a pretty significant part in the 70s about the enshrinement of gun ownership without regulation. Not gun ownership in and of itself, but some type of regulation of it. Now, we should remember, though, when we talk a little bit about using the Bible, that there weren't guns, bombs, and nuclear weapons back when the Bible was written. This is something that we're dealing with that's unique because of our technology and our abilities. The moral majority, however, really did frame the policies and that it was an attack on the Second Amendment. If you can't. And of course, Liberty University then, after Jerry Falwell passed away, his son became the president, and it has a shooting range on its campus, which is a bit ironic. But what you find, he's kind of carrying on the same idea. So you have to deal with the Second Amendment. But we also have to talk about the Second Amendment in relationship to the highest rate of gun ownership in the world. So currently, right now, it is estimated that for every 100 people in our country, there are 120 guns. So far more guns than there are people in our country. The next highest rate is Yemen with 52 guns per 100 people. So about half. So what happened was really kind of the deification of the Second Amendment. And again, the motivation behind that, I think, is profit more than anything else. Continuing to make guns and sell them. It's always about the money. It really is. The National Rifles Association will use a phrase, guns don't kill people. However, one of the things that must be kept in mind is they want to sell more arms, so they often buy off the politicians to make sure that there's no regulation on this. And yet there is regulation on this. The Second Amendment itself cites a regulation. So when you think about this idea of a well-regulated militia, that's not individuals. That's kind of a collective idea that, if there are situations that you find where there is threat, is there a way of pushing back on tyranny, that type of thing, and so forth. And so, but I never hear that. It's always kind of on an individual basis with the Second Amendment. Second Amendment is really not about eliminating guns. It's about regulating them. And I think just some common sense thing like background checks and an assault weapon ban. I think that's where we have seen in recent years that it's really warlike weaponry that is causing mass casualties and so forth. So it's doubtful that we're ever going to come to an agreement on this. However, I do think weapons of war and the potential of massive casualties kind of sits at a crossroads of law, morality, and common sense. The Supreme Court has even said that you don't have the right to own anything. You can't own, and I can't own a fighter jet. Those type of things. So the question becomes: is an AR-15 a weapon of war? Is it really needed to shoot a deer or Bud Light cans? I mean, or should there be some more regulations on that? So it's interesting, all the way back to 1934, fully automatic weapons have been restricted since the National Firearms Act. And then it was later legislation called the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986. So that's within our lifetime. And it's basically saying civilian access to military type weaponry has limitations, those type of things. So you're going to get into some heated discussions at times on this topic. And one of the things that you'll come up against is probably this reference. In Luke chapter 22, and it's a long chapter, and we're already at 8 o'clock, but the gun owners of America at one time posted Luke chapter 22, verse 36 on their website. I checked it out yesterday. It's no longer on there, but when the book was written by the author, it was on the gun owners website. And it talks about the mention of a sword that Jesus, I can't see. Turn the light on here. Okay, in Luke chapter 22, Jesus is about to be arrested, and Jesus tells his disciples, "When I sent you out without a purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything?" They said, "No, not a thing." He said to them, "But now the one who has a purse must take it, and likewise a bag." And then this is the verse that was on the website. "And the one who has no sword must sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you, this scripture must be fulfilled in me." And he was counted among the lawless, and indeed what is written about me is being fulfilled. Now that's out of the book of Isaiah. And they said, "Look, Lord, here are 2 swords." He replied, "It is enough." Okay, let's time out there for a second. Jesus is warning the disciples that trouble's on the horizon. And then he mentions about sending them out without a bag or sandals and trusting God to provide. Okay? And then he mentions a sword in verse 36. And in this whole dialogue he's having, he doesn't mention anything about a sword until he says, "And the one who has no sword must sell his cloak and buy one." Now, the mention of the sword seems to be connected to the fulfillment of prophecy out of the book of Isaiah. But I found this little notation very helpful. In the new Oxford Annotated Bible, Study Bible, it says this about verse 36. An example of Jesus's fondness for striking metaphors, but the disciples take it literally. The sword apparently meant to Jesus a preparation to live by one's own resources against hostility. The natural meaning of verse 38 is that the disciples supposed he spoke of an actual sword, only to learn that 2 swords were sufficient for the whole enterprise, i.e., they were not to be used at all. And of course, if you read the rest of chapter 22, Peter takes it literally. He's one that has a sword. He tries to cut off the head of a soldier, and Jesus rebukes him. And he says, "Those who, live by the sword will die by the sword. Put down the sword." And then Jesus heals the soldier's ear. So Peter went for the head, missed, only got the ear. And Jesus performs a miracle in healing the man's ear. So Jesus is using the sword as a prop, I think. And what he's doing is talking about violence in general, because if you go on down and you continue to read, the concept of Jesus as a warrior here and fighting against those who had come to arrest him is not the intention of the text. Jesus is giving himself over to arrest, and here would be the perfect scenario for Jesus to display his power. As that old gospel hymn goes, he could have called 10,000 angels if he wanted to, but he died alone for you and me. So when Jesus then says, "Hey," as they come to arrest him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with me with swords and clubs? I've been out in the public, and you could have arrested me anytime. Why are you coming in the dark?" Well, he's implying that this is an unjust arrest. I guess as we close up tonight, we might suggest that empire sustains itself through violence. There are times when we need defense. There are times when we need the protection of our military. But then there are times where it is used, abused, and manipulated for other reasons. And many times it's interesting over the course of our history is that we can never imagine ourselves at peace. We can never imagine ourselves without an enemy that we need to pursue. So just kind of keep these things in mind, especially now, as in the weeks and months ahead, there'll be a tremendous amount of loss of life. And we all need to make a decision whether we're going to follow the nonviolent Jesus or whether we're going to believe that he justifies violence in his name. So I want to close by just saying to follow Jesus is to follow a leader who never dropped a bomb, never commanded an army, never accumulated wealth, served the most marginalized around him, and intentionally denounced violence and greed. Here's the way that Dr. William Barber puts it. He says, the gospel's clear. We are called to love our neighbors as ourselves, which includes taking action to protect them from violence. Our faith compels us to advocate for common sense gun safety laws that reduce the risk of harm to our communities. So I think that really does kind of touch upon two of the most poignant topics or chapters in the book. So I will kind of pause our and stop our share.